Okay, greetings, brothers and sisters. This is Sunday, November 24th, and I did a voiceover yesterday it turns out to be Thanksgiving, and it's also going to be, I believe, the 166th edition of the Journey series. I think I've done 160, I don't know. Maybe it's the 165th. It's the 166th. And so here's the thing. I was in a sort of state of mind when I made the voiceovers, and I think I wanted to make sure that people got something positive out of it. It talks about I talk about the period of time where I just went through hell, that resulted in just 18 years of marriage that was just brutal. And, the sadness and the difficulty of, not reaching family goals and my family just falling apart and all these things. Eventually my daughter's suicide and all the things that led up to it, and her development as a person and these things. And before that, I mean, when I was a kid, I talked about how I went through an 18-year Rahu period. It's a dark planet in the Vedic astrology, and it was a difficult time from the time I was 10 or 14 or whatever, 10 till the time I was 28. The Saturn returns every 28 years. And it was like this thing, my youth, my family sucked. And, I don't consider myself like I was depressed or something, unhappy, because I wasn't, but I wasn't happy either. And I wasn't, happiness not being a definition of happiness. Like the definition for me of happiness is having a goal and a purpose. And I didn't have one till I was 28. So, and then I had a purpose, and then I went through this difficult experience. After 2 years of doing the Sajmark system, when I was 30, I, got into a relationship with somebody who had mental issues and abuse history and things, and came from a hellish environment or whatever, at least according to her story. And then how that affected me and the kids, and my stuff from my family, which wasn't great. But why I'm saying all these things, and I want to put a more positive spin on it before people listen to it, because I've talked about this a little bit in the Journey series as well. And I'm talking about this in reference to the collapse of our civilization and, possibly a war-torn country and things, and what it's like to go through something like that, which something that's considered a trauma, something that's considered a difficulty. And the thing is, the key to it, and I want to give some techniques here, the key to it is to embrace it with gratitude. And I can speak from personal experience that when you embrace things that are undesirable with gratitude, then they change. You're just changing your perspective. And that's what the video is kind of all about, this video. Is you're changing your perspective about something that you're dreading or something that you think is bad, and you prejudge the thing. But if everything comes from God and you believe that God is doing what's best for you, then when you have something difficult, something you don't want, and then you change it and you say, like, this is like a technique. Why is God blessing me with this? When you change something from a curse to a blessing, this is a blessing from God in some way. And, it takes some time. It's not like you have to do it immediately, but it's a process. And there's two parts to it. The second part is looking at it as a blessing. So the thing's already happened. And, let's say the system is going to collapse, or there's going to be big changes. And there's going to be a sense of loss, maybe a sense of shock and trauma, right? Like when things, change all of a sudden, and, like it just, you get like what happened with COVID. Like there was a worldwide sense of shock, right? A sense of foreboding, and, people dealt with it differently. But everyone had to cope. And then, like, when they shut down the system and everyone had to wear masks and all these things, it was like, what's going on here, right? Like there's something that's, you know, that's like different, and, that's undesirable, and, it's potentially scary or whatever. And so when things happen like that, And, when real things happen, like that's, more of a manufactured thing. COVID sucked, the disease, but the reaction to it had really nothing to do with the COVID itself, right? And it was, it was what it was, like in terms of manipulation, all these things, right? But when things, when you get bad news, it might not even be collectively the system collapses, but you could end up being diagnosed with cancer or one of your loved ones or something, like this, right? When something really bad happens that you have to deal with, and it's a shock to your system, your sense of loss, and you're like, I don't want this thing to happen. I don't like this thing. I don't want this thing in my life. Why is this happening? And you can easily go to, why is God doing this to me? Why is God forsaking me? As I get into with Jesus, right? So I talk a little bit about that in the video. And so the way to reverse that is to look at it and say, this is a blessing, and how is this a blessing? How is this helping me? And you can ask God for an answer, but also, you can just kind of, it could go on blind faith that this is in some way, helping me. But you can figure out why. Why do I need this? Why is this happening? Why is this part of my life? Why is my soul chose this? The other thing is taking responsibility that your soul has chosen everything that happens in your life. And so why am I alive during this time? Why am I going through this? For what, for a positive, like asking sincere questions and, meditating on this and finding the answer, like, how is this something that I need? How is this benefiting me? How am I going to, for me, when I went through this, and I've talked about this before, I came into this life with a deep bitterness towards God, like something that's deep inside me. And sometimes you don't know that something's there until circumstances pull it out. Like somebody is a wonderful, nice person, and then they get money or power, and they turn into an ungodly prick, right? And that ungodly prick was always inside of them, but you don't know it. And I reference war, like things happen and people do things in war that's reprehensible. And then they come back to civilization. Like this is a difficulty for American soldiers because they go into these environments where it's like just depressed and people are beaten down and it's like hellish, and the atmosphere and the condition, and then they go in as invading forces and they live under fear and different things. So like the recent wars in Iraq and these places where there was, these bombs set by people, and it's just random people. So they're civilians. You're not fighting a war, enemies. You're fighting these civilians, and they start thinking of all civilians as potential, so-called terrorists, insurgents, or whatever you want to call them, their enemy. And so they start abusing the civilians, and they come back to America after the things they've done and the things they've seen. And they're like, well, they're living in a cul-de-sac somewhere, some, suburban neighborhood, and they've entered they know that there's places that aren't like that, right? And so they have to reconcile that, the things they've seen, the things they've done, but also what people suffer in war, like just civilians, when you're being invaded and these things. And the way people will do to survive, and it just brings out the worst in people. And, you have stuff inside of you that can be pulled out, whatever is negative inside you, whatever hate, whatever deviance you might have, like things that you might be suppressing in a cordial world, but it comes out in these different, circumstances. The darkness within people have, darkness. When I talk about people going to the dark side, that's very easy for people to go to the dark side. You just need I'm going to get into this as we go through the video you're about to watch. And so, the remedy to all this is the first part is, the second part is finding gratitude. So that you just find a way to see that this is actually a good thing and pray for it and say, how is this helping you? So for me, from past lives, I had some bitterness towards God, and I used the cleaning process. I was getting multiple individual sittings from the Sajmark system. And at the end of it, I was just happier. Right now I'm making more serotonin and I'm more relaxed, and I can't even describe the difference between the way I was before I went through it. I had this thing cleaned out, and this anger and bitterness I had towards God from some previous existence was cleaned out. And like I felt it was like a bitterness, like it just was there, like just like I felt completely like everything's gonna not work out, and I felt like whatever like it was just blocked. There was a block, and when the block was removed through the cleaning process, through the difficulty of these things I was going through, the marriage, the frustration, and the lack of sort of success in the material world, doors closing all the time, things looked like they were opening and getting better, and then all these frustrations I was having, and then being ostracized by my community and the Heartfulness organization, which of course has blessed me in so many different ways, because this guy Dodgy, the guy who's current master, is a piece of shit, and the organization's collapsed, and it made it that much easier for me to accept that and move forward. And so I feel like I was blessed in every possible way, because what I went through on the other end of it, I just feel better about everything, and I'm more evolved. I'm a better person. So I went through what's called a cleaning in the Sajmark system, and I've described this in depth in Journey series, and I got the multiple sittings, and then when I went through it, like what I felt like, what it felt like to be me before I went through it, this burden I was carrying from maybe multiple lives, and I felt like I had this very long life, a badly lived long life that a lot of this got cleaned out. It changed my perspective. I was, just grateful for everything. I wanted to be grateful to God, but I was blocked because there was some frustration and resentment and bitterness towards God from previous existences, impressions that I carried over. And when I got cleaned out of this, it just, was wonderful. Like, it was just so much better. And I always, I was thinking all the time then, and I still think it now from time to time, that if that's all I got from the Sajmark system, and I've gotten a lot more from it, the meditation that I do, that would be enough. Like, that would be just, be a miracle in just one life to, take away this burden that was maybe there for thousands of years of living here on planet Earth, maybe even longer, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, whatever. That I carry this around as a, as a soul in human incarnation or whatever, incarnations. And then that was gone. Like this, it was just this perceivable thing that was removed. And just the relief was, just a complete blessing. And so, like, that's the first part. The second part. The first part is that you can adjust yourself to something that's about to happen. And I've been feeling weird lately. And it's been, I don't want to say it happened right after the election, because I don't know when it started. Not weird, but I've been unsettled. And, it's not a conscious thing. It's not like, oh, Trump's won and now I'm unsettled because Trump's won or something's going on, in my life that makes me feel unsettled. It's not anything to do with the stimulation of what's going on around me. But, it's something that's just internal or subconscious or whatever you look at. Like, when you're a little kid and you do those crying breaths, there's, like you cried when you were a kid, and then maybe an hour later you breathe and you have this weird crying breath. Like, I think most people experience this. Like, I've been having that. I don't feel sad at all. Like, I don't feel depressed, but like I'm just, there's a little bit of foreboding. And so that's, there could be a personal stuff, but I don't believe it's that. And other people are just saying they feel the same way. Like, there's, we're entering into some kind of a phase, you get warning signs, right? When there's a storm about to hit, animals will flee an area. You'll see animals just migrating and getting the fuck out of someplace, right? And so when that happens, there's intuition, and they can just feel something coming, right? We all have those things there. And I don't know when it's going to hit, and I don't know what it's going to be, and I don't, whatever it is. And, maybe it's nothing, but, if it is something, it's been forewarned, right? And, I have these predictions and prophecies and things about all this stuff, and we see what's going on in the world. And so if something's about to happen and there's going to be wide-scale change, and we have to work towards gratitude once it happens, like that's the second part, then the first part is to prepare for it internally in some way, right? And so the best example of this is the second master Sajmark system. When he was going through his spiritual journey, he said he would find out what God and his spiritual master and the divinity of soul, the next stage for his spiritual journey. Like there was these forces that are helping him along his spiritual journey, and he would anticipate the next stage. He would figure out what was going to happen, by praying and by being open to it, being, you know, uh, going to an etheric state of consciousness, and figure out what was going to happen internally, and adjust himself. Like those were the words he used, which I thought is a good word, to make it happen, to facilitate an easier transition to the next stage of his internal journey. And this can also be done to the material changes, which, always manifest into spiritual changes, internal changes, by internally adjusting to what's going to happen and preparing for it, internally accepting it, and working towards gratitude, and just understanding the shock and the trauma that the worldwide trauma and fear and all these things that are going to be pervading the atmosphere. There's going to be people feeling fear and anger and hatred and all these negative feelings coming up when there's wide scale changes, if this is what's happening, and adjusting yourself and realizing that this is part of a plan, and that there's a solution for you. There's a pathway towards success for you in this, and you don't know what it is. Like you think it's bad, but what if it isn't? Like think about the things in your life that you thought were really bad, but after you went through them, you were like, oh, this really was a blessing. Or even things that you still think are bad, but now you look at it again and you're like, oh, like how do you find blessings in things that were considered miseries, right? These types of things. And just one more thing to add to this. Like I am feel like I'm going down memory lane. I've watched a lot of documentaries of things when I was a youth. I got in some, I became aware of some of my classmates from high school, which I want to talk about. Like you probably already heard that. I'm going to talk about that today in another video. And then there's just things going on where I'm aware of the manipulation. There's been, men have been targeted, which we know from the election was a thing, and men being targeted. And it's, there's the feminists and there's the liberal agenda, but then it's happening, so it must be part of God's plan kind of thing, right? And, taking down the structure, because the power structure, this is a patriarchy in whatever way. And I had seen this trailer for this movie Blink twice. And Channing Tatum plays a billionaire who takes these people to an island and drugs them. And trauma happens. And it turns out, like, the women end up taking snake venom, and it's like 5 women and 5 guys. And the women are being abused at night, and then they are given a memory erasing drug. And it's a horrible movie. I fast forwarded through it. And at the end, the woman, it's not worth watching, but it's like they talk about human sacrifice, and it's like supposed to be kind of almost an Illuminati movie, but it's just men behaving badly. And 2 women, the women wake up to what's happening and they kill the men. And one woman takes Channing Tatum, erases his memory, and marries him and takes his money and takes control of his company and punishes all the men that were involved in the thing, right? And, it's this woman empowerment thing, and men are demons, and, all these things. There was another a Netflix series called A Man in Full, which sucked, with Jeff Daniels. And, it's the way it treats the men in the movie. They're just making bad decisions, and the women are sitting there trying to help them. Like the women are all stable, and they're all like, more evolved. And the men are just making terrible decisions. And the 2 white guys who are like in conflict end up dying at the end of the thing, together. And they're like, their conflict sort of, the men just do stupid shit, and the women are there cleaning up their messes. And then there's show that my wife and I watched together, which was like a good show called 3-Body Problem. There's some and I make reference to this in my other video earlier. But the women in the show are the smart ones, and they're the leaders. And the men are just dopey, doing dopey stuff. And the women are, the ones that are, they're the scientists and the leaders and the things like this, and they're the stable ones. It's more subtle, but it's always there. And they're putting this stuff out there, and it's this movement, and people watch things, and it changes their perspective, and they've been doing that in movies for a while. It works on people on a subconscious level, without thinking about, well, how is this going to affect an already, fucked up, stuff that has been put out there with gender and all these things. And, there is a system, and it's, not the best system, and, the patriarchy isn't the best maybe model or whatever. And, men have, there's a time of, some of there's some truth in it, right? And so, there's the end of this thing, like the end of the so-called man, right? When people said, the man is this, don't, I gotta avoid the man, this kind of thing that the hippies used to say. And so, these things are coming to an end. Like there's just this stuff. I see, generational thinking coming to an end, and these kids today are so much different, and it's the end of all kinds of different paradigms of family being destroyed, all these things. And, the end of ultimately the system itself. And how do people deal with that, and what happens next? Of course, that's the whole point behind Pockets of the Future. And so when you're entering in a phase where things are being destroyed, and there's no real plan, they have a plan, the people who control the system, but their plan will not come to fruition. And so there's going to be a destruction of one thing, the power structure being taken down, and then the absence of something else to take its place, which is, again, the idea behind Pockets of the Future. So being prepared for this the best way that you can, adjusting yourself to what's going to happen, having an open mind about what it is, and searching for gratitude, those are the keys to this. And so as I go through this story, I was able to do that through all of these things that I'm talking about here. I've learned these techniques. I've learned how to do it. It takes some work on your part, and, it has to just be done to survive something, right? Otherwise, you're just being traumatized, and, and you're saying, why me? And, you're being a victim about things. And, that doesn't help you at all. It's just, it ends up being a block to allowing what's supposed to happen to happen. And so, these are the techniques that are there for people who are going to embrace them. And so I'm, and just being aware, like you might not be thinking about this thing right now, but when things start to go down, like they're going down, right? Like it's going down. When you realize that, that this stuff is actually really happening, then you can remember this. Maybe rewatch this video and whatever it is. So this is going to be a standalone video saying, it's Thanksgiving and you're the turkey. It's when it's Thanksgiving and you're the turkey, which is kind of just a humorous title, and also it's going to be the 166th edition of the Journey series, and it's going to be the same video in both places. So without further ado, here it is. Okay, greetings, brothers and sisters. This is a video that's going to be published as a standalone video for my regular channel entitled It's Thanksgiving and You're the Turkey. Which I got a lot of enjoyment out when the title came to me. Picking a title is never great, but this is also going to be the 66th Journey series. That's just going to be this voiceover that I did, if you might have heard it already, when I published it on Thanksgiving. And so this is going to sound a little bit, I think, depressing to people. I didn't feel depressed when I was talking about it, just, thinking about things in a way that wasn't as cheery or as hopeful as some of my other videos. And so, it's Thanksgiving and people might be already bummed out because people get bummed out in the holidays, and, you might take it as something that's depressing. So you've been forewarned. But I felt like it was just a lot of, I get into my daughter's suicide and my family and my ex's family and just all these things and, life in general and hope and false hope and denial and things like that. So it's not like, you proceed at your own risk, right? But without further ado, here it is. Okay, greetings, brothers and sisters. So, this is gonna seem a little bit somber. I'm not depressed or anything. I'm just keeping it real. This is just a realistic talk, and this might bum people out in some way or another. But it's just the, every story has a positive and a negative way of saying it, right? When I was in India, there was this great guy from Iran who he did some sort of I don't know, like presentation seminars that were I don't want to call them these things that you see here in America where people do these they go to these retreats and there's some public speaker on how to be a winner, these kind of things, like, because it was, the guy was more sincere than that, right? But you have these, these sort of gurus that people go to see in these seminars to, pump them up and get inspired, inspirational type of whatever they are, right? That really tall guy, I forget his name, but you know what I'm talking about. Those kind of people. It's kind of like that, but like this guy was a real person and, a neat, authentic, cool person, like a good person. And my family and I was going through something difficult. We were going through a lot of difficult things in India. And I was talking to people there. I mean, it might have been the crisis we were having with immigration or whatever it might be. And, we had overstayed our visa and there was just this whole hellish thing. We had to go through this thing with the Indian bureaucracy that no one should ever have to go through. It's just really bad. And at the time, my ex, I mean, during that, she went off her thyroid medication for a week, and which is this is hell. She was on this thyroid medication, and when she wasn't on it, she would get not only physically sick, but she would get emotionally. Like, I was supposed to watch for the signs, even if she was, like, if her dosage wasn't enough, she kept on upping her dosage. And when her dosage wouldn't be enough, it would be, she would go into some emotional hell, right? Which I'll kind of get into in a bit. But, there was that was happening, and we were basically our relationship was ending. All these things. I guess I'll talk about these things more in a bit. But it was a really dark time, and he said things differently than everybody else. Like everyone else was hitting the panic button about our situation when I talked to them, and he was like reframed it like in a different way. And one of the great things about the Sagemark system is when you're going through something difficult, it's a misery as blessing. Miseries as divine blessings because they're cleaning out things, miseries are, that block you from your connection to God. And if you can reframe it as being something you're grateful for, a misery, it becomes a blessing. And so it's one of the great aspects of the Sagemark system. So if you can turn a problem, a misery into a blessing in your own mind and look at it as such, it changes everything, right? It's a great thing. And so there's that. Like and I often frame things like be grateful. I say at the end, that's what I'm talking about. Be grateful is you're grateful for whatever God's given to you, right? But in that same light, in that same whatever it is, the positive way of viewing things. There's also you can look at anything. There's people who get good things in their life, and they make them worry, right? They make them miserable. When things are going well, right? There's that great song by that rapper NF about it's called Happy, and how he's, he gets more worried, or at least he's singing about people or himself. I don't know that when they're happy, they get concerned, right? They're so used to not being happy that it feels incongruent to them. And that's a lot of people. And things are going well for them. They get a few breaks. Then they're just worried about how the things are going to be taken away from them, right? That how this thing that, they have this oasis of a brief time where their life doesn't suck. And they worry more about that, than when is it going to stop? Like they're just, when they're miserable, they know, all right, this is what I'm used to. I feel safe. I feel, this is congruent. This is what I deserve. But then when they have this brief moment of success or happiness or something, and they're miserable because they're waiting for it to be taken away. I'm very aware of this, and this is the main part of what I would talk about. I just was like, the beginning is about that you can restructure anything to sound positive, put a positive spin or a negative spin on anything, right? You can take a situation and it could be a doomsday or an opportunity. It can be a blessing or a curse, right? But having said that, one of the reasons that I hope that people can see that I'm neutral, they might come off as harsh about people being, going to the dark side, or, when you look at people who end up being what other people consider evil, criminal, whatever it is. And of course, there's some sociopaths and some people are just hardwired to be bad. But, there's a lot of people that just things went south, right? And when you look at homeless people and you look at, people who, and, you don't want to look at them because they represent something that could happen to you. Like any person in the world, whatever they're going through, could be something that could happen to you, right? And people who have gone through some shit in their life, like real horrible things, like they've had a time in their life where they were in a traumatic situation, know what I'm talking about. When you wake up every day and life seems hopeless, and not because you're depressed, like chemically, like that, and that's also it, right? But like that's like who you are. Like you wake up every day, and like some people are just born with, or they have, given the circumstances of our society, the effects of food and toxins, and they wake up and miserable. Like you just don't think you're ever going to get out of your miserable situation. You wake up feeling hopeless every day. And people do that. Some of you guys listen to that are feeling that now or have gone through that, right? No other people have gone through it. Where you wake up, and I went through a period like that, which I'll describe in a bit, right? Where life is just hopeless. And, this could happen. Circumstances of your life can change where it just seems like everything goes against you. And it can happen quickly. Like you're happy or everything's going great, and all of a sudden you get diagnosed with cancer. And that sets off a series of, next thing you know, you're addicted to pain medication, right? Like it's just, one thing leads to another, and then, things just won't go right. Like if you ever had a really beat up old car and you fix one thing in the car and something else breaks, and then you fix that, and then before you know it, you could realize you could have bought a whole new car, right? And then eventually the car just won't run. You're like, this thing's just, it won't work anymore. And that happens eventually to everybody's body, where just your system starts to fail. You have system in your body that starts to fail. You got your vascular system, and you got your digestive system, and you got your, your lung, the way that your ability to breathe and things like this, respiratory system, whatever these systems are, right? These are systems in your body that function in a way, and you have these organs that do a certain amount of work, and like any kind of a mechanical device in your body is a machine, right? Your body is a mechanical device that these different things work together to make the whole thing work. And then you start having these systems that start failing, right? Kidney failure and liver failure and heart failure and these things, right? And as as these organs start to fail and you get older and the whole system starts breaking down, and it's just, every time you go to the doctor, you get more bad news, right? And then you realize, oh, I'm dying. Like, I'm just going to die now. And that's just what's happening. And you got to come to terms with that. And you go through a process. And, most people die poorly because they've lived poorly. And so they're psychologically fucked already and all these things. But, I'm aware of this. Like, everyone's just one bad day away from going over to the dark side. Like, it just happens. And circumstances can unfold, tragedies, broken hearts and, things where people just mistreat each other, or, abusive situations and just, bad luck or whatever people want to frame it as. That everyone's just like one bad day from going over to the dark side, to where they're miserable, hateful, like they look at everyone else who's happy and they're jealous and spiteful and angry and hostile and just, whatever. I mean, some people just don't have that in them. They don't have that in them. They don't have hatred in them. They don't have this stuff, envy and things. So when they go through it, it's a little bit less, or it's not so powerful. But people who don't have a lot of anger in their system or a lot of jealousy or things like that, some people have more of that kind of stuff than others. But either way, when things just go south and everything gets hopeless, there's this write up that went around maybe like 5 years ago. It describes some country that the economy collapsed. And it was like this hellish environment that everything degraded into gangs. Like housewives were prostituting themselves for food, and local communities devolved into gang warfare. And the people who had the most weapons and were the most violent took over, and everyone else was in fear. And there was these various gangs, and there's no rule of law, and there's shortages of everything. And it just described this hellish environment that happened. Like just the economy collapsed, and then within weeks, the whole system community devolved into that, right? Like most people have in their house less than a week's worth of food. Like after a week, after the system breaks down, we all saw this during COVID, when the grocery stores, when they were out of everything, there was a rush on toilet paper, but like canned goods and things. During COVID, we all saw this, right? Banks didn't have enough cash to give out. Like we went to our bank to withdraw some cash, and the bank was like, "Oh, we don't have any more money." Like and we weren't withdrawing like a lot. It was just they were like, "Can you take a little bit less because we don't have enough cash on hand?" And I'm like, "Well, that's every bank then. Like every bank in the country is, everyone's going to withdraw cash because people are panicked, and this is happening. Like it's like a run on banks." That was just from COVID, and that was bullshit. The stuff to do with COVID that was so exaggerated. I mean, it sucked, but it was they used it as a fear-based thing, and they closed the economy for the first time. I mean, the history of America, our economy's never been closed down. In fact, when something bad happens, they go out and spend money and do the economy. I mean, other than whatever happened in the Depression, which was an economic collapse. But even in the Depression, like people reverting to cannibalism within a short period of time. Like there's ways that people, behave when they're in a war-torn situation, and it's not good. Like the worst comes out of you. When they say the war is hell. My brother went around and he was counseling Vietnam veterans, and the stories that he was getting from these guys, because they're psychologically fucked up because things they saw, and I'm not going to tell you some of the stories because they're brutal, and they're confidential. My brother shouldn't have told me, some of the things. And they're horrible stories. I worked in treatment centers with kids who had been sexually abused and abused other kids, and these kids lived in hell. Like it just, when you'd read their intake, report file, and all the things that went on in their lives, right? So like I had one kid who, his younger brother showed up. Like he was a 7-year-old kid, and he was in with the other 7-year-old kids, and he was acting sexually, so they put him in our cottage, which was 10-year-olds and above. But he was 7. He was within this with 10-year-old kind of predators. Kids who had acted out sexually. I mean, it's just so sick, right? But he was in the cottage with the little kids, and he was so creepy with the little kids, they had to put him in a big, with the older kids, which was, whatever it was. And one day his little brother showed up. And I'll tell you about his life in a moment. And his little brother, was this, 4 or 5-year-old kid, and he had glasses on, and he was in a little suit, maybe with a bow tie or something. Like it was something like that, or just a little tie. And the social worker brought the kid in, right? He was a cute little kid, he looked like he was just kind of innocent, right? And I was like, well, I knew she would brought the kid to say goodbye to her brother. Like the social worker was a woman that, brought this kid in to say goodbye to her brother. And I go, well, what's going on? What's wrong with him? And she goes, well, he has AIDS. And I was like, holy fuck, right? I was looking at this kid and going, he's had fucking AIDS, right? Like it just fucking hit me. And I knew about the family. Like the parents took these 2 little boys out as a young age, toddlers. They were prostituting these 2 little boys, right? Like this is real shit. Like people hear about Jeffrey Epstein, people hear about these kind of things, but I was seeing it like real fucking shit before, I was ever on the internet. Like this is, 1990, I guess, two? What am I thinking here? Like 1990 something, right? So like 1990. So I started meditating in 1993. So this is 1993 or four when this happened. So like I was on the internet. I didn't know I didn't know anything about any of this kind of stuff, right? And these parents were like drug addicts and criminals, and they trained these kids like little monkeys to do sexual favors for people, and also pickpocket them and steal things, for a very young age. And so the kids were like completely fucked. And somehow this little boy was given AIDS or HIV, and it turned into AIDS during that process. His brother was 7, and they were just, and it just like hit me, like I was like depressed and just like I wanted to die. Like it was like just the reality of these kids' lives, right? Like there was a lot of shit I saw, a lot of bad stuff, and a lot of things that I heard or whatever, read in the reports, and just horrible. And there was just all these treatment centers all over the country with kids like this that were sexually abused in some way or something, and they had acted out and abused other kids who are now fucked up too, and these kids were all traumatized, and then all these things, right? A lot of these kids, most of the kids that I work with, were going to be institutionalized the rest of their life. They were just miserable, and the institution themselves was, well, let's group a bunch of sex offenders together and give them some bullshit therapy that doesn't work, and let them, it's just like putting all the prisoners together. You put all the worst people together, and they just get worse, and then the security guards, right? The prison guards, they get bad. Like there was this young woman, like she was a New York City. When I went to get my second chance at college, or my third chance, this is when I graduated from, and I went to Springfield College School of Human Services. Springfield was a town I used to go because my older sister lived there. She was a social worker there, and it was right on the border of Connecticut and Massachusetts. And it's where the Basketball Hall of Fame is. And so I went up there a few times. They had a little zoo my sister would bring me to when I was a kid. I went and stayed with her for about a week. And I ended up working near there. This is where the first treatment center I worked with. And so it was, pretty close to Connecticut where I lived. I remember driving up there and getting my ears pierced on some Sunday. Like we went up there, me and my friend's brother. And he had his ear pierced, and we were like kind of a little bit drunk, and we went up there to buy alcohol because Connecticut had these laws where you couldn't buy alcohol on Sunday, and I ended up getting my ear pierced, like which is like stupid, but it was this place that I was familiar with, and I ended up going to college there, and they had a good program where you could get credit for life experience, like college credits, and so they had a lot of people who were social workers. It was a human service program. And people who worked in like prisons or worked in some kind of human service related field. And people would come up because it's more adults. It was for people who were like, working already and had jobs, sometimes families. And they had long weekend classes, right? So people would, work during the week and then would come up with these long weekend classes. And there was a woman there. She looked like Lauryn Hill, the singer for the Fugees. Well, was a popular band at the time. Really nice girl. She was, 20. I was in my later 20s. She must have been maybe in her 30s. And we were in a couple of groups together. And she was working as a security guard. She was like good looking, like she was and petite, small. I mean, prison guard. And her fellow coworkers said if she didn't have sex with one of them, they were going to set her up with the prisoners so she would get raped by the prisoners. Like that's what the prison guards were doing, right? And she reported it was a whole thing, like, and there was like these prison guards ended up being like criminals because they were working in these prisons, right? Because they were around fucking criminals all the time. And I, experienced that because when you work in treatment centers, you're around the worst dregs of society. And it's, the opposite of what the Sajmark system is about. The other thing I was doing at the same time. So I started meditating, and the Sajmark system is based in, there's the master of the system and there's the various practitioners, and and the master of the system is just on a higher level. Not now with Kamlesh because he fucked it, but the current master of the system. But Charji was, when you were around him, like his energy and his consciousness, it's hard. I can't even describe it. It. Most people have people in their life who are just better. Like they're the people you go to, and you feel positive when you leave their company. You've met somebody like that, a teacher. You know, somebody who's just operating on a higher level. They just have a better energy, or just people in your life that pull the best out of you. And then you have friends and people who, when you're around them, you do stupid shit, and you like, you're a worse person. Like they bring you down. You have people who bring you up, and people bring you down. Like you have those people you've experienced in your life. Like I hope you have. Like I can't imagine maybe you have and you just don't know it. That's fucked too. But it's people who pull you to a higher level of consciousness, right? And that to many of you is what you get here with me, because for years and years I had that with Charji, right? And then not only Charji, but there are preceptors and people who did the Sajmark system that were just on a higher level. And did they have their bad days? Sure. Did they have their human days? Sure. They're not, they're not infallible. But when someone's a saint, like that's what it was like to be around Jesus or Buddha or any number of the saints, Krishna, these various high developed souls, the ones that were actually, spiritually elevated. And when you meet someone like that, they have this energy. They just walk in the room and you're like, who the hell is that? Right? You can just feel it, especially to people who are sensitive. And they pull people up. So I was in this experience where I was working in treatment centers where I was being pulled down by the dregs of society and their families and all of it, right? Like there was this guy that came in, he was working in the lower cottage, and he just came in as the unit manager there was a manager for each end of the week. Like there was a manager from Wednesday till Sunday, and then Monday through Saturday. I'm sorry, Wednesday through Saturday, and Sunday through Wednesday. And the staff would all come in on Wednesday for a staff meeting, so there was an overlap, right? And there was a manager for each end of the week. And he came in was manager for my end of the week, which was the Wednesday through Saturday. And the kids loved him. The young kids loved him. He was in the cottage where it was all like kindergarten through, 9 to 10 years old. And he was doing well there, really young kids. And our cottage was 10 to 14. Sometimes there's some overlap with ages. Like I said, some young kids would be moved up because they were so horrible. And then they would be like, they were bullying the younger kids, and now they were being bullied. Like it was a whole fucking thing, right? But the guy came in, and he, got into this with this one kid who was really tough. The staff, like, this kid was a nightmare. He was hard to restrain. He had punched his principal. He was sexually abused by his mom, and he was like just like a horrible, horrible kid, and just really tough. And he came in and had this really, like he thought if he won over the toughest kid, that he would have better control of the cottage, and it just caused chaos because they had this weird relationship, where he's like, there was a time where the kid went to court, and this guy took the kid to court, and his mom, was denied custody because she had sexually abused him, and she ran out of the courtroom, and the kid who was because of his abusive behaviors was not allowed to be out in public, right, without being supervised. And the kid just runs out of the courtroom. And so the guy had to run him down and restrain him, like on the steps of the court. Like, people are walking in, lawyers and people, and he's like fucking getting this kid in restraint, right? And so the whole thing erupted, and like the whole place was just in chaos. Like it was the worst time that I worked there, right? The kids were all triggered all the time, and there was just, everyone hated this guy. So he had this idea to have a family picnic. And there was a park that I was familiar with. Like I had gone there, and later I'd bring my own kids to it years later. But it was a park that had like paddle boats and, shit like that, right? And most of these parents had lost custody of their kids to the state, rightfully so, but the state wasn't any better, right? So, they take these kids out of their homes, they stick them in foster care where their kids are abused by their foster parents or by other kids, or, a number of things. It's just like a fucking mess, right? I can't even get into how much of a mess the system is. And I'm getting away. I'm not even close to what I was going to talk about here. So, but the parents showed up, and these parents were like, dregs of society. And I looked at the parents, like I know some of them, but they were just bad. And they start yelling at their kids. Their kids are freaking out, and the kids are all triggered because their parents are there, and their parents were horrible, and they miss their parents and love them, but the parents are just, the whole thing just devolves into this mess. And I'm like, this is what like a picnic is for these families, right? Like somebody's getting raped, somebody's getting knifed, so like it's just like everything's like bad, right? Like it just, there's just criminal behavior and just, fighting. And, it's a kind of like you were at some place and there's a family over there and you're like, well, that family's fucked up. Well, there was, 20 of these families all together, right? Like just some, horrible people, right? And there's just levels of degradation out there that people aren't aware of. But anyways, let's get to the main point here. So like when society breaks down, there's no food in the grocery store and whatever could happen. Like there's a break in your, we see this with the hurricane and things like this. We saw it with various, Katrina with New Orleans. We see it with the people in North Carolina and Georgia and South Carolina and, Florida. We've seen it a bunch of times, where you don't have all the things you normally have. And you're in a desperate situation. But if you're invaded by another country or you're being bombed or there's a war and, war just brings out the fucking worst in people. It's bad. Like, and that's probably coming to us. Like, we'll experience it. And whatever you are like now, right now in your life where you have like a heated room and, heated house and food in the refrigerator and a car to drive places and, things to watch on TV and things to do on the internet. Imagine if all that shit was gone and you don't know where your next meal's coming from and everybody around you now is a predator. Let's say you have stuff that you're worried about people coming to your house and taking it. There's no cops, no rule of law, these types of things. And how quickly things can degrade. And you'll see this. Many people will experience this. It just takes a few people to panic and get aggressive and start trying to steal things from other people or force their will on other people or whatever it is, to where everyone stops trusting everybody else. Like you see this in all these post-apocalyptic movies where people are seen as a threat and a predator. Like everybody's coming into your territory wherever you are. And, like that movie The Road, where people are devolved into cannibalism. And everybody's a potential cannibal because there's no food. So every person you see, you're wondering if they're going to try to eat you, right? They're going to try to kill you and eat you. And everybody that comes across you, like these things. And it's hard to imagine, like put yourself in that situation, what kind of person you'll be in that situation. What people are like when they're in war, in war-torn countries, because we haven't experienced it. But, everyone's one bad day away from, or this kind of situation, of turning to the dark side. And I know this because it just is. It's just how it is. You have a potential saint in you, a soul, and you have an ego, and you have within that ego and your subscribe framework and your survival tendencies as an animal, like what an animal will do to survive, like what an animal will do when it's constantly under a state of fight or flight, like this kind of thing. And people have that in them. They have darkness in them. They have anger and hatred in them, whatever. And we can see it. We see it being pulled out now with Trump and with Kamala Harris and the division in our country and the hatred and, families that can't sit down for Thanksgiving meal anymore because of the political differences, right? You already start to see it. You're seeing the ugliness of people being brought out of them, the hatred, the darkness within. So I woke up this morning, I was thinking about my daughter Anna's suicide. And she was just a horrible person. Like, she wasn't like that when she was a baby, but she had some things, like whatever she came in with. She used to let out these blood-curdling screams. Of my 4 children, when she was born, she was the only one. Like I wept. Like I was listening to this song by the Moody Blues. Well, she was the only one of my three kids where I had a strong sense of her soul before it came in. Right, her older brother was born, and I was like, well, that's my ex was older. She already had two kids, and I got sad one day, and I was like, that's probably it. We're not gonna have any more kids, right? Which it was this kind of moment, and my ex was she had some sort of she was like abused, but she had like psychic abilities, right? She had family abuse and things, which also often opens up psychic abilities that are not trustworthy because a person's fragmented, but they're able to connect with spiritual whatever it is, be mediums or something. But there was this thing that happened where we got in touch with this soul that was waiting to be born. When a woman's going to be a mom, there are these souls that will be with them, will be around them, waiting for them to be, to get pregnant, right? They're waiting to create their bodies. And so you can see the souls around young women, especially ones who are, you know, close to getting pregnant, like women who are in their college years or, graduate college or whatever, sometimes in high school, obviously, whatever it is. But there are souls that are around them that are, waiting for the chance to be born into that family. Like when people say, well, I never chose to be born. Well, that's not true. Your soul has to create your body, right? You're alive in your mother's womb. They can show you what you look like, and you're living a life. You're in your mother's embryo, you're in your mother's uterus, and you're living. You're moving around like you feel babies kick, right? So you think there's no soul in there. That's why abortion is murder, because you see that the baby's moving around. You can hear the heartbeat, like there's a life in there. They put the ultrasound. It's a big day when you, and the ultrasound is, I'm hearing that my wife has told me, and I've heard, so I haven't done research on it, but it's not a good thing, and of course it wouldn't be. You're in this safe environment and you're developing very rapidly. I mean, you're developing from a two-celled organism like an egg and a sperm, like this, zygote, and you develop into a human being with 9 months, right? Like it's crazy. Like the birth process is where a mammal or any creature develops quickly. An egg, there's an egg, and there's a little dot on the egg, like a fertilized egg. And if you have a rooster, so like you have chickens and rooster, you'll see the little dot. And the yolk is the chicken's food. And so there's a little dot that is attached to the yolk, and that's the baby chick. And it's nothing more than a speck. Like a day after, if the egg has been fertilized, you open it, you get an egg, and you get an egg that's been fertilized. You'll see this little dot, and then within a period of 23 days, it becomes a chick, like the kind of chicks you see in like a Tractor Supply store if you've ever seen a baby chicken, right? 23 days, it becomes from a dot to a chicken. Crazy, like a little tree, like a little acorn. In 100 years becomes a giant oak, right? But it develops into a sapling and these things. It starts to grow, and how quickly things is able to, change, especially in the primary years. And that's what happens with a baby. And so it's a living thing, right? And there's soul there that connects with, the mother ahead of time, and the father. It's around the parents, and it's there when you're, having sex, when there's a soul with you, a third soul that's wanting to be born and is creating its body. So we felt Anna's soul ahead of time. And I remember coming home from the hospital. And I heard this song I don't like this song. I mean, I never thought about it, but it's just playing on the radio, and I'm kind of in a daze. There was a lot of, she was born in the middle of the night, midnight or whatever. And there's just something about when a child's born and being around that. It's a miracle. Like, it's a miracle of human life, right? The potential that's there. You have this potential saint that's there. Of course, most people turn out pieces of shit, But I mean, there's this, element of like just, there's just something there, right? There's a baby is just this pure, pure potential. And it's just great. Like, it's just a wonderful thing. Those people have been around, the birth process when you see a newborn baby. And then when you're a kid or whatever. And like that first, moment where you see this person that's going to be a part of your life, right? And that it's just like the miracle of birth. And all these, the four births all had they're interesting. But this thing with Anna, she had a nice birth with the other one was my son's birth was much more, dramatic in the way it happened. And there was like a lot of stress involved. And her birth was this great doctor who wasn't my ex's doctor, but was in the same practice. And he was my doctor. And I really liked this guy. And he just sat back and let the thing happen. Like, he just wasn't. There was just him and a nurse who used to be a midwife who was just great. And so, it happened at midnight. It was this thing. Like, she was born at 12:01. She could have been born. She was born at 11:59. Her brother's birthday, her older brother, who was a year old, they were both born on Mother's Day. It was this kind of thing that happened, right? And she was born the 9th. He was born the 10th. But they were separated the days. She was born at 11:59. Like, 1 minute later, they would have had the same birthday, right? But they had these two separate birthdays. And I was driving home, and it said, so I started to hear this song, right? And at this part, I'm looking for someone to change my life. I'm looking for a miracle in my life. And if you could see what that's done to me, to lose the love I knew could safely lead me through. Between the silence of the mountains and the crashing of the seas, there lies a land that I once lived, and she's waiting there for me. And I don't know why this thing, it's just like the miracle in my life kind of thing. And I'm listening to this thing, and I just start like weeping. Like, I just like get really like, overcome with emotion, which, just doesn't happen to me. Like, I can't think of it, so many other times this has happened, and with the other bursts, it didn't happen, right? But Anna was, she had some great characteristics and, qualities, but she was like difficult from the beginning, right? She would be later diagnosed as bipolar as a young adult when I was no longer in contact with her. But she, my ex had, well, I'll get into that in a bit, like her family. But she would let out these blood curdling screams for no reason. Like, it was, we had a friend who came over to stay with us when we had two young kids. So we had two, like a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old. And Anna would be in the high chair, and for no reason, she just let out these screams. And they were like, they would hurt you. Like, they physically would hurt you. And this woman was like, oh my God, how do you guys take that? Like, she was like, it's awful. And I'm like, I don't know. It's like, she just does that. Like, she just, she was like kind of insomniac and had adrenal issues. My ex was having adrenal issues because of the stress. She was, she was still going through a divorce process, like an extended divorce while these kids were being born. And our lives were hell and stressful. And she had lived a, difficult life. And so, Anna developed like insomnia, and, her mom had it. Like, my ex was insomniac, and it's just a horrible thing. When I went to graduate school at that time, I was in graduate school, and that was very stressful. Like, it was a lot of stress. We had like, of all the things that a marriage can have, we had 8 of the top 10 stressors, right? That would, marriage, divorce, childbirth, like poverty, going back to school, like, all these things that cause stresses in people's lives, right? That are, all at once. And, she just had these things, and she was difficult. Oppositional defiant would be a diagnosis that could have been for her. But she was just really tough on the other kids, and just as things developed, like, it got worse when she was a teenager. Like, she was, there was good times and bad times with her, but she was just high need and high maintenance, right? Well, let me go back to, like, I woke up just feeling this, right? Like, I was just aware of it when I was in my meditation. I don't know what's going on with me today, but it's just this thing that came. And I was just remembering this moment when I realized my family, where I was the dad, sucked. Like, my family sucked, and we were fucking doomed. Like it was bad because there's always things can go one way or another. And life works in such a way that, hope is like almost like a negative thing. Hope is something where, and I've talked about hopium with the cubies, like hope can be a horrible thing because it keeps you from confronting the reality of your situation. Things can change in a moment. I mean, one of the things that in the Sajmark system is that as long as there's life, there's hope that the person will change. Like even to your dying breath, you can have a momentary, the worst person in the world on their deathbed can, say, God, please forgive me, right? And they're not going to be saints in that moment, but it's a good thing. It's a trend towards the right direction, right? Like a dying person, their last breath, who's lived a horrible, shitty life, Scrooge McDuck, or the real Scrooge, the worst type of people, whoever they are, murderers, the worst type of, people live horrible lives. But, a lot of the people who are criminals were sexually abused or, came from horrific circumstances, right? So you have to remember that, oftentimes, and it isn't like they're victims because what do they do in a past life, like this kind of thing, right? So it's, I mean, not that to blame people, but it's just that has to be there where whatever happens to you, you got to realize that you were something in the past, and whatever that was, good, bad, and ugly, is going to be there in your future. The part, unless you've dealt with things and you've sort of cleansed those tendencies from previous existences, they're going to be there in your next existence. If you commit suicide in this life, then your next life you're going to have the circumstances where you're likely to commit suicide in your future life, right? Whatever it is. But I woke up thinking about all of this because there was no chance for the family and the marriage to be successful because both my family and my ex's family were horrible. And we both had this idea that somehow we would turn it around, like individually and together, that we would take the shitty families that we came from, and because of the Sajmark meditation, the cleaning, and because we were just, better people than our parents or whatever, that we somehow would change the trajectory of our existence from our shitty families and make a good family. And like that just doesn't happen. Like it can happen. Like people get better. The idea is that as shitty as your parents were, you'd be a little less shitty. Like you'd be better. Like that's the way it should be. Like each generation should be better than the last. But that's not what's happening right now. Everybody's getting worse. We see it. Like I now know from my life, from the years, the different generations that I've seen. The generations that were there before my generation and the generations that's come after. And we've become worse people. Kids born today are worse than kids born in my generation, just based in the trajectory and the way that we're going. We're going downwards and, idiocracy. We're getting worse and not better. Like everyone can see that. Everyone should realize, it's not about your technology. It's about the kind of people you are. And we're getting worse and not better. And so, start off with my family. So I have three sisters and all older than me. So the next one is my sister who's 10 years older than me. And then she had a sister that's 2 years older than her. And there was another sister that's 2 years older than her. And then my brother was 2 years older than my oldest sister. And my brother was 17 years older than me. So my sister was 10 years older than me. And then there was a 7-year gap between her and my brother, right? And so it was, my dad was Italian, Albanian. My mom was Irish and German. And they were Catholics. And there was a miscarriage before and after me. My dad was smart. He was the first and only person in his family to go to college. He had two older sisters. Three sisters, two sisters. I think he was the oldest, and he had He had three sisters, and two of his sisters didn't marry. They were old maids, and they were their own nightmare. and his family was very depressing. And my dad grew up kind of as must have been kind of nerdy, in the New Jersey area, and um, kind of a loser, like just a loser. My mom said she married him because she felt sorry for him, which that's not good to hear. And my parents were just very incompetent. Some examples of this: they just were always screwing up, and like I realized I was smarter than them and more efficient than them at a very young age. Like we would play card games, and I would tell them what to do, or board games because they couldn't figure shit out. Like I would just be like, "No, you do this, you do this." My dad said, "Well, we should just be cardboard figures." So I'm like, "Well, we should not even be playing these games because it's like I'll just win if like like it was just like I was always winning because they weren't stupid. It's just whatever it was. Like they were just they were in a daze. They were like TV people who just didn't know how to deal with life, right? I started smoking pot when I was 14. So I my friend and I built a zip line, and I've recently described that, and I fell off of it because it's completely unsafe, and we should have never been allowed to do that. And I woke up in the hospital, and my mom was gone. She was in Florida, visiting her parents or whatever. There might have been a health issue there, and so my dad, who was completely incompetent, had to deal with walking out into the woods behind our house and seeing his son laying there, completely unconscious and probably being dead. And my dad was again incompetent and didn't know what to do, and so I was taken to the hospital. I woke up in the hospital 12 hours later. I had a concussion, and I started getting migraine headaches. And at some point, I started smoking pot because the kids around my neighborhood were all smoking pot, and we were all in the same grade, and it just happened. Right? It was no big deal because that's what was happening in those days. Almost every kid in my high school ended up smoking pot, like the majority, or at least half of them, right? And then probably if they didn't do it in high school, they did in college, and probably, it wasn't a big deal. But it was to my parents, even though my older brother had been in Vietnam and used all kinds of drugs. He tried opium in Vietnam and, whatever it was. And my sister was a, hippie, so I'm sure she smoked pot. I don't know about my two other sisters, but the one didn't, I think. But my younger sister probably did. But my parents were freaked out. One of the things happened was I went to a party. It was like a freshman in high school, but I was like 5 foot. I was like one of the shortest kids in my grade. I was, my family were late bloomers. There's longevity in my family. All my grandparents lived, three of my grandparents lived to 90, and the other one, I've talked about this in the past. Both my parents lived into their 90s. And so my brother and I grew a lot later, like into our 20s. And my sisters, I think, we were also late bloomers because it was just different for girls, like they grow faster. But still, like after I graduated college, I grew 2 inches. High school, I grew 2 inches. And so anyways, I went to this party, like a keg party, and played beer pong. And it was the first time I got drunk, and I came home. My parents were having a prayer meeting, and there's like nuns and shit in my house, and I had to walk by them, and I staggered up the stairs and started vomiting up beer in my bedroom. Like it was this thing. It was like a fucked up thing that happened, right? And my parents started to worry about me. And so they decided to go to therapy. And like I didn't know what was happening because there was no conversation. When my mom found my bong and I hid it in my beanbag. And I was smoking pot, and they knew I was smoking pot. And we didn't ever talk about it. And I've told different stories about this. But there's never one conversation. We never had one conversation about any of this stuff. And we end up in therapy, and this guy is a therapist, and he's missing his middle finger, and he's smoking a pipe, and the pipe is sitting right in between his middle finger. And it's all I can remember because I'm like stoned out of my fucking mind. Like I didn't do it on purpose, but this therapy was supposed to be about my drug use, and I am fucking baked, right? And like I'm not saying a word. Like I'm not like this was supposed to be about this. My drug use was supposed to be some horrible thing, right? But it was not anything that was ever discussed in the whatever therapy sessions we went in there. And my dad was arrogant, and he thought he knew more than the therapist, and he was critical of all the kids and blaming all the kids. A lot of blame was coming out of him. But I barely remember that. I remember the guy just, and I think he was blowing smoke circles. That's how I remember it. But he had this pipe and he was smoking, and and I'm sitting there, and I think I was stoned for every session. So whatever happened in that first session triggered my brother, who had come back from Vietnam, and he had a horrible relationship with my dad, like hated him, and everyone kind of hated my dad. But my brother leaves, and my brother now has two kids, maybe three kids. Like he had three sons. I'm not sure when my youngest nephew was born, but he has at least two kids and maybe three. And he leaves the session, three kids, because I was in high school. And some guy cuts him off in traffic. He gets out of the car and punches the guy's window, and his watch flies off and breaks. And he doesn't come back, so he's out. Like he lasted one family session. My brother had agoraphobia and things, and he was suffering from all kinds of shit because of the family. And you know, it was just completely incompetent. The therapy didn't do anything, and whatever was going on with my drug use, it was never discussed. I remember people being mad at me for some reason, but I was stoned, so I didn't like it. Just I was like, oh, people are saying bad shit about me, but I was like, whatever it was, right? And I was in high school, but I remember a lot of arguing and crying and people all irritated. And I think it lasted like 4 sessions, maybe for family stuff. I don't know. It didn't last long. And I just knew my parents as incompetent. And my dad was just like, I remember just watching him chew at dinner, and he would put his glasses down the tip of his nose, and he would read the paper, and he would eat real slowly. And I just wanted to stab him in the fucking head with a fork. Like I just fucking hated him, just by the way he was chewing his fucking food. Like it was like that kind of relationship in the family. My mom, again, she said she felt sorry for him, and she took care of him in different ways, but was never in love with him like in any kind of way or whatever it was. But two things happened. There was, when we were homeschooling, my ex was homeschooling our kids. She started to see that they had issues like some kind of different learning style, and she thought they might be dyslexic. And she wasn't sure about them, but when she read this stuff, she was like, well, you're definitely dyslexic. And she read me this description. And, you know, I looked at it and I'm like, oh, I'm totally dyslexic. And I'm fucking like 32. So I called my mom up. And I had these extensive tests at Yale where it came out that I had a really high IQ, which intimidated my parents. Like, it's like in the 140s or whatever it is. I'm not like a genius, but it's high, and it was high to the extent that I didn't even try at school or any of these things, or academically. I mean, IQ isn't a good way to assess intelligence, but they could see that I was really smart, right? And people can see, you guys could see that here. But I had, I couldn't make my, I couldn't do the alphabet correctly. I got my B's and my D's incorrect. And so they were testing me, and they never talked about the results of the tests, right? I'm 7, 8 years old, and I was struggling in school. And I remember they were kind of intimidated because of the intelligence. Like the guy said, he's really, really like smart. Your son's really smart. Whatever it was, like gifted or something, right? Which I guess my mom kind of told me a little bit about. So I called her up. I'm in my 30s. And I go, Mom, I'm dyslexic. And she goes, oh, yeah, you are. And I'm like, why didn't you say anything? Like, I've been fucking going around my whole life, and that would have been helpful. And you had knowledge of it, and you didn't fucking tell me, right? Like, you didn't think to tell me I was dyslexic? Like, what the fuck? We had zero conversations. Like, I can't remember talking to my parents ever, like, sitting down and having a serious talk that wasn't like, oh, you're a piece of shit kind of thing, or, blaming or whatever. Which at a very young age, I was able to say back to them shit about them because I saw things in them that kids just shouldn't see in their parents, at a younger age and as I got older. And so when they would criticize me, I would say shit to them about like what they were. So they stopped talking to me, which I guess suited me fine, right? Another example is when my third child was born, my daughter, we were in Idaho. And my mom came up for the birth. And it was interesting because each one of my kids, like my older son, reminds me a lot of my brother's oldest, my nephew, my oldest. I had 9 nieces and nephew, and my oldest nephew is very much like, they had expressions and things where I look at my son and go, oh my God, that just looks just like my nephew. Like they would, and they were different people. Like they definitely have different personality traits, but they're similar type. Like they have, like that's the person that I would say was most like in my family. Of course, there's genetics from my ex as well, so there's that. And then my Anna was like my older sister and my younger sister, the two that were the youngest sister and the oldest sister. They're both older than me, but she reminded me of both of them, like physically, and she's a really good athlete, and I mean, just reminded me of these two. And my third child, my youngest, reminded me of, she had the same constitution as my mom, who was always very sick, and my middle sister. Like she just remind me of them, right? And then my youngest son reminds me of my couple of my nephews, like just very similar. And my nephews, like you know, I could see similarities in them to each other, right? My nephews and nieces. And then there's just this part of them, that was Romano, like fucking Romanos, right? That my family. But I could see it, that you can't escape some of these things. Like they just had the same tendencies, the same mannerisms, as other people in my family. And, some of them, whatever similarities there were to me, right? There was these things. But my mom comes out, and I think it was the only time she came out for one of the births of the 4 kids. It was the only time. And she comes to Idaho, of all places. She's in Florida. So it was like across the fucking country diagonally, like fucking, whatever. And she basically says, where we're sitting there, and my daughter's like just been born. Like it's the day of her birth. And my mom says that I was a rape baby, like my dad forced himself on her. And, I'm a reality based person. Like I can accept hard things, hard truths. But I block that out. But my ex brings it up like 2 years later. And now I remember it forever, right? Like, so there's that. Like, whatever happened between my mom and my dad, and, my dad was, he was, I think, sexually frustrated, and, they were using birth control, and I don't even know. My mom was frail, and, like, I don't even, like, get into this whole thing. But why would you tell me right after my daughter's been born? Like it's just so fucked up thing to do, right? Like, and probably I didn't need to know it at all. I mean, you didn't tell me I was dyslexic till I'm 30, but now you're telling me I'm a fucking rape baby, right? Like it's so messed up. Like there's just these things, when my parents came down, they were doing the meditation, and we had this sort of spiritual gathering, and it was when my ex and I were getting together. She was married, and, like practitioner of this system, meditation system. And my parents come down, and we're driving to the Grand Canyon, and we're an hour away. We're like in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is whatever, close to the Grand Canyon. And my mom locks the keys to a rental car in her fucking trunk of the car, which puts us 4 hours later. We finally start driving to the Grand Canyon, like to get a locksmith out there. It's just shit like that my whole life, like just doing incompetent things, and there's a misery and a depression in my family that whenever I went back and saw them, like I would be happy to see them for about an hour, but then it would just set in, I think, for all of us, how sucky we all were and how sucky we felt to be around each other, right? Like how bad our family was. And it wasn't something that you could put your finger on, like, abuse and, these things. It was just miserable, depressed, incompetent, fucking struggling through life. My dad was a guidance counselor, and he complained about having to drive to work over the mountain or whatever it was he complained about every day. And, there was nothing there, like nothing, just, mundane, in a daze, watching TV, all these things, kind of like no, like consciousness, no thought, no, like, any kind of, whatever it was, like just like zest, like any kind of dynamic nature, just trudging through life, right? My brother told me a story where his my older sister, and so they're 2 years apart, and they're walking to school. And he sees his sister, my sister, ahead of him, and she's just kind of depressed with her head down and walking, and he sees that she's struggling, like she's just he knows he's struggling, like whatever, like he kind of knows as his family. They're younger kids, right? Elementary school, and he just can't help her. Like he realized she needs like help, but he's like struggling himself because they're just miserable. Like it's not, just I can't even describe. It's like when there's abuse, you can say there's abuse or something, right? There's alcoholism, but it wasn't anything like that. It was just miserable, incompetent, fucking loser people, right? Like just, like, my mom was, she was at least spiritual, and she did the rosary, and she went to church, and she had a spiritual quality, but she was always worried and, fear based, and, making like weird decisions and making up weird shit. And, she was the better of the two. Like everyone, my mom was someone that you could talk to, and she was more reasonable, and she was, more giving and whatever. And my dad was just narcissistic and just fucking stupid and like just low consciousness. He was smart, like he was really smart, but he was stupid, like just whatever it was. And he died basically alone. I mean, my mom and him split up for a bit, and just all this incompetent stuff, right? And so when I was at this treatment center, I had this interaction with this kid. He'd been sexually abused by his mom, and he was acted out. He was just a miserable kid who's been in an institution forever. I've talked about this kid before. I've talked about this story multiple times. And so at some point, we ended up in the timeout room. And I used to do this 9 p.m. prayer, which is, I do it with my eyes open. The kid he didn't get restrained because he wasn't violent, but he was acting out, so he had to go in the timeout room. He's pacing around like, this kid was just filled with anger and hatred. And his mom had, sexually abused him. There's two kids, that other kid who I talked about, that was sexually abused by their moms. And there was other kids that their moms participated in the abuse. But those kids were always the most fucked up, like because the mom was the primary love source, right? And the kid is walking around, and at 9 p.m. we do this prayer that everyone in the world comes to spirituality. And I'd often do the prayer, my eyes would be open, but I'd be in a timeout with these kids. When we were leaving, my shift ended at 10. So if they were unsettled at 9, like it was bad, because there was one guy that was coming in, and he had to manage these 14 kids, and sometimes the kids and he would go to sleep, right? We found out later because kids would talk about it. But we had to have the kids all settled and into their rooms so that they weren't running around like little fucking demons that they were, right? Like they were horrible kids. And so, and the kid just all of a sudden starts crying, and like I never seen the kid cry. Like he was just, tough, hardened, institutionalized kid. And I said, what do you want out of life, right? And he said, I just want a family that loves me. And it really affected me because, I was getting my degree in human services, and I'd later go on to get my degree in counseling. But I realized, you can't help these kids. Their parents were so fucked up, and they were so far gone. And, there's the dregs of society, and every person who works in the counseling field, you have to work with the lower level people, like the people who are, in the system some way, social services. And it's just there. You have to go through that. And I realized I couldn't help these kids. Whatever I wanted to do as being like some part of me wanted to help humanity. I mean, that was years ago. Now I'm like, you know how I am now about it. Because of all this, because I know you can't do it. I know like everyone who thinks that they can help other people, but you can't help yourself, right? Like why don't you fix your own fucking life, right? And so this is what I realized, fix your own fucking life. But when I was sitting there going, it was when I got this idea that I would, and plus I was, reading the Sagemark literature and about this idea of the upliftment of people. As you become a spiritual person, you lift other people up, and I was experiencing that from the system. And I was like, well, having a great family is what I needed to do. Like I made that decision. I'm, 29, 30, and I'd be married in a couple of years. And that, if I wanted to make society better, if I just had, whatever number of kids it was. Like, I had no idea. But if those kids were just better than me, like if I, the kids would just, like I could provide a better life for them than I had. They were a better person than I was. Like they were better people than I was. Then that would be like just good. That would be all I could do. Like that was great. Like if I could just do that, right? If I could just have kids that were better than me. Because if everyone did that, we'd be going in the right fucking direction. If each one of us, each of us that we got married and our kids were better than us. Like if I could create a better family than the family I grew up in and create better circumstances. And of course I was going to talk to my kids, which would be somewhat, it would be much better than what I got. Like my parents never talked to me. My dad was a guidance counselor and I didn't know how the fuck to get into college. I had no clue. This is what my dad did for a fucking living, right? We never once had a conversation about, like, it was just this incompetence, right? So that's my family, right? And believe it or not, my ex family was way worse. Her situation was way worse, right? Okay, so I just went to eat breakfast and saw that Trump had appointed a bunch of people from 2025, including the co-author, to his cabinet, which is Project 2025, and some of these other things. And, I'm going to make this a standalone journey series and also just a standalone video. I want everyone to hear this stuff that wants to, And so, I don't want to get into too much stuff with my ex. I covered this extensively in my journey series, especially the initial 1, 2, 3, and then I redid the origin story fairly recently. But, when I first met my ex, I drove out to see her and her family. She was married, had 2 kids. And we were both preceptors in a region where there was only 2 preceptors. There's a third one that either would move there or was there already that I didn't know about, who was near Flagstaff, and that's where we had that gathering by the, or he was in Phoenix, maybe, I don't know. He was in Arizona somewhere. And so, upon meeting my ex, she told me that she had been sexually abused by her dad, like the first time we met. And I noticed this over the years. She would tell people upon meeting them that she would tell them that she had been sexually abused. Like in the first or second conversation, she would just say it. She told everybody, like everybody knew, and she talked about it regularly. It was like her defining characteristic. And I learned, like as we, the end of our relationship, that it was important that people knew that because she always wanted to be considered a victim. She identified as a victim. There's this this quote that I have. Let me see if I can find it here. There's this quote from it says this: "The victim stance is a powerful one. The victim is always morally right, neither responsible nor accountable, and forever entitled to sympathy." And, part of the relationship stemmed from this idea that I had worked with kids who had been sexually abused, and I knew about the effects of sexual abuse. And I was always impressed by her ability to function, which I attributed to the Sajmark system of meditation, which she was really into. At least I thought that she was into it. But if you don't take responsibility for the things that happen to you and the things that you've done in your past lives that draw to you things in the future, then you're not really doing the Sajmark system. And she never was able to do that because she always wanted to feel like a victim and used that victimness to get other people to, be on her side or, defend her or whatever it was. It was a manipulation tactic that I don't even think she was conscious of. It was like basically her defining characteristic as a person. That she was always being attacked by this person or that person. She was always being victimized, and even her health or whatever it was, that somehow it was never her fault, and whatever was happening to her was just like a good person was suffering from the bad behavior of other people, and she was good at convincing people that was the situation and getting people to help her. Like that was her, feel sorry for her, give her sympathy or whatever she was getting out of that. And her story was that she was sexually abused by her dad numerous times, regularly by him, when she was a very young kid, as long as she could remember. And the worst thing had happened when she had come home from college. Now she was a very good student. She was like one of the top students in her high school, and it was of a rich suburb. Her dad was a CEO of a company. Their mom and dad were these uh, elite level people, but they didn't help her financially, and she was in poverty all of her adult life, from the time she left home in college till I guess probably even now. Her whole life she's in a marital situation, and she was always complaining about a lack of money, but would sabotage any chance of any of that happening. She could have married some millionaire. She went to an Ivy League school in Boston. She went to Wellesley College, which is where the years and years ago women used to go there so they could marry a Harvard man, or one of the many. Boston has all these elite level schools. MIT, Harvard, and Boston College, and a lot of them. I don't even know all of them, right? And so she associated with million. She dated some millionaire, from wealthy men and things like this. But she ended up marrying some guy who was struggling financially, who was older than her and like kind of messed up in his own right. Like she ended up leaving him when he got a really severe diagnosis. Um, which is, I'm not going to get into all that, but that was ended up how we got together because of this. Him having this psychological write up and things, and her being alone with a couple of kids and needing somebody to rescue her, and she sucked me into that narrative, which I'm not claiming I'm a victim of, but like I recognize what she does and who she is as a person, right? But the main story, here to kind of get a sense of where she came from in terms of her family is that her mother used to um, buy her outfits as a young girl, and she would have her daughter go and model those outfits for a husband that she would later admit that she knew had weird sexual stuff, right? Her dad, after she stopped him from abusing her, he ended up having sexually sexual inappropriate behavior at a high level. He's like CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and he got fired because of his sexual behavior towards women who worked at the office. And so, like, he had this, he was a deviant sexual person. And the reason this my ex knew this was she went home for Thanksgiving and she had the worst sexual abuse type situation with her dad, or the worst incident, and came back and tried to commit suicide at her college, and was put in a support group for other women who went to her college who were suffering similar circumstances. They were suffering abuse at home. So there was these elite level women who were members of prominent financial families who were suffering this kind of behavior, right? And her, she went home because of this group to confront her family because no one else knew in the family. And her dad had said if they ever knew, he would leave the family, his wife, and he would disown everyone. He would just leave everybody. So she came home and told her mother, her brother, and her sister. And her mother gave her a long conversation about she always knew that her husband was weird sexually. She said this, and which meant that she was aware of this potential and kind of served her daughter up by sending her to the guy, modeling clothes like when she was like a little girl, and he would abuse her, right? Like it was like a sickness there. And then a day later, she received a letter from her mom saying that she was tearing the family apart by her telling everybody about what happened with her dad. And it was just a long letter blaming her for everything and telling her what a piece of shit she was. So the mother blamed her for her husband abusing her and her telling everybody about it. And then she was hospitalized again. So I think she tried to commit suicide twice. And she was the person that cut herself. And, the family was so fucked up that her brother came to visit and they were talking about some of their, just childhood things and the neglect and things. And we went to an area where her brother and her realized that they had walked like miles when they were 4 and 5 years old, like just, were left alone to walk to these places and just all these things, right? Just completely neglect in all these ways of, like a kid who was in kindergarten walking 3 miles away from their house to get somewhere, like it's just, just these types of things, right? And they both agreed that their mother was worse. Their mother had the borderline personality disorder because the brother had looked into it and figured out. And my ex, I realized she had that as well. And her ex was given this diagnosis. So there was the borderline personality disorder is one of the worst ones. People think about the narcissistic personality disorder or the antisocial personality disorder, which used to be the old sociopath. So anti-personality is what people used to call sociopath or psychopath. But, she had these issues. And her mom, even though her mom was, physically abusive, and my ex had, was tales of her mom hitting her. One time her mom punched her in the back and she went blind, like she couldn't see. And when she went to therapy years later, and the guy said, "Oh, you're a true hysteric," because she had this condition called hysterical blindness. And so really fucked up, right? This family was really fucked up because if the dad's a sex offender and he's the better of the two parents, you're in a fucked up family, right? And so how that translated, my ex was apparently or projected or claimed to be a devoted person to Sagemark's system. And I knew that she was a lot better off by her stories and just her behavior because she did Sagemark. Like she had been institutionalized, right? And she was, she had been locked up in psych wards, had tried to commit suicide, and she had a lot of issues. She was stalked and a lot of bad behaviors and a lot of things, very promiscuous, and she had all these things, very at-risk behaviors. And she had, pulled it enough together. And, I thought that her first marriage was more her ex's fault. And she was good at convincing me of that, which I'm clear now wasn't, because the same conditions were there in our marriage, right? So just there was continuation of her victimness and victimhood and all these things, and her need to be a victim, and framing whatever narratives that were going on in her life in that way, where she was a helpless victim and everything was unfair, and she didn't do anything or wasn't responsible at all for any of the things that were happening to her, either in a previous existence, which is the Sagemark philosophy in terms of samskaras, but the many bad mistakes and bad decisions and things, the way she would behave and her attitudes and the nightmare environment that she created around her. And when we have a normal argument and disagreements, and I can be a real asshole because of my family, and we were just, just the reason I don't like hanging out with my family, I have that same stuff in me as they do, right? Like I don't want to be around them because of the way they are, and I'm like them, right? So, there's that kind of element, and so I would say harsh things and mean things, and I was insightful, and it took me a long time to realize that, I would see things in other people that they wouldn't see in themselves. And when I pointed those things out, it was pretty hard for them to hear, right? And I thought that everyone just saw it and, whatever it was. And so, my ex had a positive side. She was really smart. She had, a visionary personality. And she would delude herself to be in these positive states, false hope. But there was something inside her that would always sabotage any chance of her being happy. Her wanting to be a victim and her internalization of her abuser and whatever she brought in from a past life. She was born on Halloween, and she would tell stories. She would talk about how she had past life experience and memories of being burnt at the stake as a witch and, whatever went along with that. So she remembered being victimized lifetimes for, not just this lifetime and this kind of attitude of being a victim. And she would provoke conflict with people, and when they would react to her, she would claim to be a victim. She would never take responsibility for the way she would provoke people. She would always try to instigate fights with me, and as I matured and I realized it was a nightmare situation, I tried to resist her trying to provoke me, as our relationship went on. And then we would have these arguments, and she'd start punching herself and saying, like slapping herself in the face and punching her legs and saying, "These are what your words are doing to me." And when you you make me want to kill myself. And she would run and get a knife and pretend that she was going to cut her wrists, and you know, sometimes, whatever, threaten suicide, to the point where some of my kids later on would be hiding their knives. Like, if I knew that we were getting to an argument, I would take all the knives and hide them. Like, that's how fucked up my life was, right? And it was one fucked up thing after another, and she was very eccentric. At some point, I realized we were screwed. Like, I knew she wasn't getting better. And I just was like, I can't leave, and I just had to suck it up and, deal with my shitty situation. And I was depressed and like hopeless and waking up every day, never thinking that things could change or get, turned for the better. And, this was the environment my kids grew up in. And when we were having these really, bad arguments, my ex said my daughter Anna was an empath and we should put her in the middle of the argument. I mean, there's arguments where my ex would get suicidal and like she would flip out and just get fucking crazy. Like she would just, like there was a time where she ran out to our old barn and she took off her shirt. It's like November, this time of year. And oftentimes, like when it would come around this time of year, Thanksgiving area, when this bad incident happened at two consecutive Thanksgivings, the one where she was really abused, her worst incident with her dad, and then when confronting her family and telling everybody the following Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving was always a horrible time for her. And she would relive out this issue, and it would also often involve her trying to pick a fight with me or something. And we had this really bad argument, it lasted for days. At some point, she was out in the barn, and I'm like, I better go fucking get her because, whatever it was, I think she had a knife on her. And so I went out there, and we had this loft in this broken down old barn that was held together by a rusty old wire. And like, I don't know how this thing was still standing. And she was in the hayloft, and she had no shirt on. It was freaking freezing. It's like, below, like freezing temperatures, below 32 degrees. And she was rocking back and forth with a knife pressed to her chest. And she looked like she was fucking in The Exorcist, right? Her head was bobbing and fucking shit. Like, I was like, oh my God, right? And so, like, she would just flip out. And so putting my daughter in the middle of that situation, I'm like, that's a horrible idea. We don't want, like, I did all I could to make sure my kids weren't anywhere around us when we were arguing. Like, they were upstairs or they were out playing or doing something. Because I didn't, they knew what was going on. They could hear it, but, I didn't want them, seeing their mom like that. She had a couple instances where she had psychotic breakdowns around them, and Jesus Christ. And so, my family sucked. And like I said, I can't really describe it because it isn't as easy to describe how my family sucked. But my family was much more healthy than this, craziness that she came from, right? Like the abuse and the mental illness and all of it. And so at some point my daughter started to be, because she wanted to be in the middle of these fights, and it triggered in her, she was already, had issues. It triggered in her copycat behavior where she started to threaten suicide, and she started to pick up knives like she was going to kill herself, and, these things, right? Because she saw my ex, she saw her mom doing this, and she started copying these behaviors. And she already was kind of difficult kid and really had problems, but then she just went over the edge. And like, and I don't know how much that event, it was inevitable or whatever it was. And, she had issues. Like all my kids have some, like there's mental issues that run in my ex's family. I mean, there's mental issues that run in my family, but, hers are much worse, right? Like these big time diagnosable things. Like her brother did all this research trying to figure out, how fucked up his family was. And like they were both children of alcoholics and they were only children and, all the things that were wrong with them, right? His mom had borderline personality disorder and other things. And, she was so fucked up and manipulative. And so, my ex was just not getting better because she was attached to these demons inside of her. She was carrying around her abusers, her parents with her. It was dominated her inner world. And she would sabotage any chance of success. Like I realized that towards the end of our relationship, that we never amount to anything because she would never be successful. She would always sabotage whatever projects we were doing, wherever was going on. And, my kids were fucked up by the situation. And, I feel like my family is probably better. I mean, I don't know. My parents suck so bad, but it doesn't matter. It certainly wasn't. I didn't do what I wanted to do. And we had this intergenerational family farm. And my kids don't get along with each other now. And, I always hoped that they would have each other at least. And, of course, my daughter Anna committed suicide. And she was just such an awful person, because of these conditions and all of it, right? Like by the time she was a teenager, she was just really bad, violent and manipulative and, self-destructive. She was cutting herself all the time. And whatever I did to try to reason with her, there just wasn't any of it. She just wasn't, there was just no doing that. And I thought when she got away from the family that, maybe she'd do better, but she started doing drugs. She did LSD. Somebody gave her a gun, like one of her friends. She just had a gun, and she was the last person in the world I would ever want to have a gun. Like I was hoping she wouldn't get her driver's license because I didn't think that she'd be somebody who should be behind the wheel of a car because she was so impulsive. She was, she was really impulsive and made really bad decisions. So she committed suicide, I think, in 2000, and I don't know how many years it goes. It's been. It's been since 2021. I went and looked it up. She has like a tribute page now. You know, I talked about it on here on my YouTube channel, and all these people. I said, please don't say anything, because like you'll watch the video maybe a year from now, and you'll just say something like, "I'm sorry to hear about your daughter," and it'll just bring it back up. Like it's just not going to help. And people had said over the years, I wish you were my dad. Like, all these things like this, right? And it's saying that my daughter committed suicide. Like, there's just no way. And even just this thing that I've said to you, a little bit about my life and a little bit about my ex's life and a little bit about my family's life. And there were really good times in my family. There were things we did together, and especially when the kids were younger, and they played so well together, and there was harmony. And then we had a farm; and they learned to milk, and be with the cows. And there was, incidences and breakdowns and arguments with my ex, but I always had like hope that it would get better. And the hope I had was mostly in the Sagemark system, because it had transformed me. Like I was a low functioning person who became a much higher functioning person because of Sagemark. And for my kids, I had hoped that when they got old enough to do the system, that they would be able to be better people, and that happened. My 3 older kids started together in India. The Kamlish had reduced the age of you could start when you were 15. It used to be 18. And my kids were 15, 16, and 17, so they all started at once. And they all did the meditation. They went to meditation with their friends. Were all doing it at once. Like a big young group of young kids, they were all there at the ashram, started at the same time. And my kids I could see the effects that it was having on them, even at a young age. Like they were just better, and it was inspiring. And Anna was like her best time. Like she just was, for about a month, she was just like a better person. And I knew this could happen. Like I have full faith in the Sagemark system. But I now know that there are a lot of people who benefit from the Sagemark system that either quit or just went south. Of course, the master of the system, Dodgy. And my ex, like whatever was going on with her, the system wasn't going to help her enough to, she wasn't going to confront her, the darkness within her. And, I had a conversation with her at one point, and this was a turning point in our relationship. So I was doing research on MK Ultra mind control, and I was listening to all these women who were saying they were victims of this system, where they were sexually abused and it had twisted their personalities, and they showed multiple personalities. My ex had showed, like one time we were watching this movie, my daughter Anna found this documentary called Buck. And it was about this guy who he had suffered severe physical abuse by his dad. His dad just beat the shit out of him. Very violent. And he became a horse whisperer. And he told the librarian, somehow the librarian, my ex or my daughter had told the librarian about it. And the librarian had horses, and she changed the whole way she dealt with horses, where they were using a lot of force and a lot of, whipping and, the bridle, the bit, the bit that they put in the horse's mouth, which is, painful for the horse. And because of this movie, she was changing the whole way she approached her horses. So we went to watch the documentary together, and it was pretty brutal. It was not really for kids. And my ex started to get, like, I could feel her. She was sitting next to me on the couch, and she started to tighten up. And it was the trauma of the abuse that this guy's story triggered whatever she grew up with. And she just age regressed and turned to a 2-year-old girl, like right in front of my kids. And she went into the bedroom. She was taking little steps, like she was, and I never knew if this was bullshit or it was an act. Like I can't really tell you even now how much of it was performative. I know some of it was real, but some of it was definitely performative. And she started talking like a 2-year-old girl, like this, like infant, 3-word sentences, right? And this happened a bunch of times where she would have like mental breakdowns. Another time she went and she was like a little girl for like a day, like after an argument. And it's just all these things, right? And she just would have this like psychotic breakdowns. And other times there was like, I felt like there was either demonic entities coming through her or, alternate personalities or both, whatever it is, right? So I'm watching this, I'm doing research into the MK Ultra, and I'm watching these videos of these women talking about what happened to them. And my ex had exactly the same symptoms and the exact same thing. And her dad was, I don't know if he was a Freemason or was a part of this. Like, I don't think he was, but, the behavior that she had, the circumstances she had gotten, that she had grown up with, were very similar to these MK Ultra mind control programs. And I was like, holy fuck, right? And so I sit her down and I'm talking to her about it. And she starts like falling apart and she says, I feel like this is all true, but if I have to confront this, I'll be schizophrenic and I'll be locked in a hospital for the rest of my life. And I'm like, holy fuck, right? And that's when I knew like I was fucked. Like she wasn't getting better because she was going to have to confront her abuse and take responsibility and, all the things and realize that she had done things in the past life that, that created the circumstances in her present life, because that's what we believe as Abhyasis of the meditation, right? And that she was never going to do that. And like for about 2 weeks, I was just like, what the fuck am I going to do? And I'm trying to think about, some of it is just I'm so depressed and I'm just like, like life is just miserable like every day. And I'm trying to figure out like a way that, that we could get divorced or whatever it was. And the kids were being homeschooled and they were all behind because my ex couldn't, she had years wanted to homeschool. She did research and she was great at researching things. And she had all these programs and all these dreams about homeschooling. But then when it came time to homeschool the kids, she wouldn't do it. Like she was just dragging her feet. And then she just sabotaged it for years. And, the kids got, like good education at times, but it was so inconsistent. She was having breakdowns and mental breakdowns and health breakdowns. And she was constantly having health issues. And, it was just a mess. And the kids were all behind. And, I was like, I can't leave the kids alone with her. Like she's going to get like custody and she'll get the majority, so I'm thinking about my options and we're broke, we're poor. And just, there's just no way to fucking do it. Right. Like I'm stuck. I'm fucking stuck in this thing with somebody who's completely fucked up and it isn't going to get better. And if they try to get better, she's going to like have this meltdown. Right. And like, I'm like sitting there just like realizing like, this is it for you. You're just stuck in this situation and you can't get out of it. Right. Like there's no solution. You just got to live with this reality. And so I just said, I just got to be really positive and loving. It isn't my nature to be like, restrain myself from being critical or saying negative things, but you just can't do it anymore. You got to just, whenever we get into a fight, it sets us back. Whenever we get into an argument, it sets us back for weeks. And you just got to just resist any kind of, provocation. I mean, she would like try to provoke me. She would say, "You're going to hit me, big man." She would like get in my face and try to, get me to, she was just brutal, like just like fucking sucky. Right. And, I'm an asshole. So like I would say mean things and, I would, I know how to say things that hurt people because I could read their, them psychologically and I would do that. So, I say things that, really upset people and, that I shouldn't say, right? And back then it was much worse. Now I'm, kind of over it. Like I just, whatever I say here, like that's kind of harsh or, crosses the line. It was much worse than that. Like, I would, and it was much more personal because it was people I was in relationships with, right? Okay, so I just went on a walk with my dogs. Um, it's cold outside. And I realized I'm going to release this thing as a standalone video on Thanksgiving. It's going to be called Sometimes It's Thanksgiving and You're the Turkey, which you'll already have read. Um, it's like a Thanksgiving Day message, but not, whatever it is. But let me just say this. So, you know, things did get better for me, obviously. Like, I wouldn't have been able to do this YouTube channel had I stayed in that. I had a YouTube channel, but I wouldn't be able to do it the way I'm doing it now. It really took off when we were in India, my ex left to come back to America, right? And, I had to be somewhat in denial. I had to have false hope. And, that was because it just was necessary, right? Like it was just something that had to be there because I couldn't survive otherwise. Like I had to delude myself into seeing things that, there was always potential and we always had a good time. We always had, fun times and good times, right? But, as I started to see it and was more realistic about the circumstances, like I didn't find any way that we could be able to turn things around. Like as we moved the kids got older and older. My daughter Anna was acting out more and more. My other daughter was sick all the time. My other son was acting out in different ways. Like they were all issues. The family had issues, and there just didn't seem to be any way that we could. I was trying things. I wrote the book The Choice. I was doing things with the YouTube channel. I was trying things to make our economic circumstances better, and all these different things that some way of like reversing and accentuating the positive, because there's always positive things to build on, right? As in getting my master's degree in counseling, one of the good courses I took, this was a guy who was one of the better teachers there at the program, and he was showing different techniques and psychological models behind group therapy, like how you would do group therapy. And there was this one guy he identified. I have no idea what the guy's name is, but he was a famous person that wrote books in the psychological world. And he identified something like 15 healing factors, things that bring about healing. And one of those was identifying the health. Like if you were dealing with a family, oftentimes there's somebody who's holding the family together. And ironically, everyone in my family thought it was them. And it was definitely me. And so, there's one person that's the health of the family. Oftentimes it's a kid, the parents are fucked and the kid, whatever. And you have to identify that person and support them. Because if they snap, the whole family's coming down. The whole, work, or you find this at work and, organizations and teams. There's people that are just holding things together. And they're absorbing a lot of the other bullshit from the acting out people, the people that are less functioning, right? And so, there's these healing factors. But one of the things you need to have is hope. You have to believe that things can get better. And they can get better, but oftentimes it isn't about your circumstances or material circumstances changing. It's about you changing and being more realistic and accepting what you have. And it's dealing with it, right? And so my family and I had this intergenerational family farm plan where we were going to have a piece of land and the kids were all going to have houses on this land and we'd support each other. We'd be able to, it would be the having, because of all the things we went through as a couple, having no support system, having a lot of kids and having a lot of stress. And so it seemed like, given the circumstances of the future, the way the world was going, and having a place where we could grow food and, work together as like, an old-fashioned family, like a frontier family, right? And I knew that was fucked. Like, at that point I knew it was fucked. We went on an extended camping trip, and there were good moments, and the kids came through in different ways, and like I have good memories of these things. But there was just, everything was going south, and my ex and I, we just would have these periodic fights, and there was clear disagreement. And when I made that decision to be really loving towards her, like I wasn't going to be as much of an asshole, and I wasn't going to react to her like trying to, like by that time, I wasn't complaining or criticizing her very much anyway, because I recognized when we have an argument, it brought us to hell. So I would do anything just to avoid an argument, because it just sucked the life out. It was just horrible. And I started being real positive and loving and trying to focus on gratitude and being grateful for the good things that she had. And as soon as I did that, she turned. Like before, when I was a real asshole, like especially in the beginning of the relationship, she thought I was she thought I was like great, and was totally loving and whatever, and I was stressed out and negative. And now that I was being completely positive, she and loving, she like turned, because like that's not what she like she didn't want that, right? Like it was something that she claimed she wanted, but she didn't want that. But anyways, so there's one time we were settling in. It was probably around dinner time, and we went camping for like 3 months. Went to these different campsites, and there's great things about it, but And my younger daughter, who shared a room with Anna, and Anna had been so difficult and provocative, but they all had issues, right? But my younger daughter used to she would let things build up, and then she would kind of get really angry and explode. You'd almost always verbally. She wasn't physical. Like she didn't get into fights with her other siblings, but she would get so mad at one of the kids, and then she would just launch into like hours of like all these like laundry listing all the reasons the other person was a piece of shit, right? She would just hold it all in, and she just snapped on Anna, and she started crying and ran towards her and just physically started to attack her. But she was much smaller than Anna, and Anna started to beat her up, and we pulling them apart, and we pulled Anna apart, and like Anna got pissed, and she ran over and grabbed a knife. I had this knife that I used to cook food with, a kitchen knife. And it was really sharp, and it was in a plastic case. And it's a big, chef's knife, right? And I saw it, and my son saw it, and, my oldest son. And we knew if Anna got that case off, the plastic case, that someone's going to the hospital. Like she was going to attack somebody or hurt herself, and whatever it was bad. Like she was really impulsive, and she was really like hysterical. And so we grab her and the knife, and we're rolling around in the frickin' ground, and it's like we're right in a patch of poison ivy. Like I'm very sensitive to it because I've had it, a number of times. And all of us are. I'm doing everything to hold the case of the knife, and Anna's like, she would get violent and like scratch and bite and like do animalistic type of like, I mean, she it was. And, and I'm like, oh my God, what kind of family do I have? Like this is just bad, like this horrible stuff, and later on she would say that she was trying to commit suicide. And, like if somebody got caught and we had to bring them to the hospital, if it was one of the kids particularly, there'd be an investigation, the cops would be involved, social services. I mean, it'd be a mess. And I kept on trying to tell Anna this. It's just because I said, they're going to institutionalize you. And that's what ended up happening to her after she left. She cut herself really bad. My older son walked in on her. My younger son was coming to visit. He lived with me, and he was coming to visit. And my ex decided to exclude Anna from seeing him because she was so fucked up at the time or using drugs, and she didn't want me to know about it or whatever her motivation was. She decided not to tell my younger son, tell Anna that my younger son was coming to visit. And Anna found out, and she cut herself. And my older son walked in, and she was bleeding so bad, she had to go to the emergency room, and they locked her up and put her on a psychiatric hold. And they roughed her up, which I knew they would because she's so, she's so oppositional, defiant. And, they have these big orderlies there. And then she was locked up in a psych ward. I knew she wouldn't do well then. I kept on saying to her, your mom, it was about the same time. She was at the same age as her mom, my ex was, when like these things just, these cycles just keep on repeating themselves, right? and there's just these genetic dispositions in these families. Like I know how tough it is to be a Romano, and like I don't even know in terms of my ex's family. Like it's, they have my kids have that in them, right? The genetics and the, and some of the social aspects of that, family. But and I'm saying all this because there's times where denial and hope, false hope, are just necessary to get you by. But at some point, reality is reality, and you have to deal with it. And like I had to deal with it. Like my kids weren't going to have an intergenerational family farm, and I had put everything into that, right? Like I didn't have a career to speak of, and the farm thing. I mean, it was a whole thing that my family we went all in on, and I kept on doing things, to try to better our situation, but my ex would sabotage him, and it was just whatever it was, right? And, the relationship wasn't good because when you're in a family like that, like everybody's defensive and tight, and, they're just trying to survive themselves, and they just don't have, like my brother, seeing my sister walking to school and just knowing she was hurting but couldn't help her, right? And like, that's how my family was, and certainly my ex's family. And we tried to do something better, but of course, there was just no chance. It was like they was doomed. And I realized we were doomed. Like we went to India, and it just became more and more clear. And then, of course, there was the splitting up, and all these things. And I have not much of a relationship with my two surviving kids, and of course they had a suicide. And my son's living here, and he's getting better. Like he's got a job now. He's trying to figure things out, but he has these things he has to overcome, like all of them. And you can't do it for them, right? And I'm saying this because we're in a similar situation in our in our whole world, our culture, all the people in the world are in this situation. We're on the cusp of something bad, and there's lots of good things. Like you can always look at the good things, and some of the good things are there's the front of the building, and then there's the back of the building. Like you see some beautiful building that's owned by some bank, right? And you see the front of the building, and you see these well-dressed people, secretaries, and people like a big corporate bank or something, or whatever it is, corporation, and all these well-dressed people in their fancy cars and suits and beautiful offices. But then you find where they're making their money and how they're making their money. And it's gross, and it's criminal, and it's immoral, it's unethical. So there's a front of our society. There's, what things people want to see. It's like the, people's Facebook pages. There's what people want to see, and then there's what really goes on in their family, or really what's going on in their internal world or their lives, right? And sometimes you just got to deal with the suck. Things suck. Even good things suck. Like there's there's all the people that I worked with and seen over the years, all these little sex offenders and all these people I counseled, and I would see moments, even the worst people, my friends who were the worst sort of degenerate kind of people, or was in college, or all these things. You would see moments where people rise up, and their higher nature comes out. I mean, everyone has moments like that, and there are moments when you be around saints and higher developed spiritual people, where they'll have a low moment, or they'll just be in a they'll be selfish or self-pitying, or victim, feel like a victim, or everyone has their time where their ego takes over and their soul takes over. For the saints, it's just something that they do. It becomes something as they're moving forward. More and more, it's their soul that is. I don't want to say dominates, because the soul doesn't dominate. It's much more gentle, but their soul is their primary state of being is coming from their essence, and they are service oriented, and they're just good people. And then people who are criminal or negative, they have flirt with their higher nature at times, but their lower nature wins out, right? But there's always, in that sense, hope that the person's going to be better. But your circumstances are your circumstances. And if our civilization collapses and there's World War III and things go south, there's no hope for that. Like that's, it's just going to be that way, right? Like if your family collapses, or your economy collapses, or you get cancer, or you get something terminal, you're going to die, right? Might not be initially, but you might last 10 years, but you're now facing death, right? Whatever it might be. If you're younger, sure, maybe you overcome something, but you're never going to be the same, right? It's going to be worse. And that just happens as you get older. You lose the ability to do things, you're not functioning as well, your body's not working as well, and you're getting closer and closer to your inevitable death, right? Which is just what it is, right? It's just what happens. It's not bad. Oftentimes you could say it's good. It's never bad. I mean, it's tragic for the people who miss you, sure. If there are people who love you and people depend on you, or people who, if you're a good person and you'll be missed, and, your soul or your presence will be missed, then yeah, it sucks for those people. When somebody good dies, it sucks, but when somebody who's not so good dies, it's usually just a relief for everybody, right? Like when my dad died, I don't know if anybody in my family cried or was sad. Like I wasn't certainly sad. And not because I was angry at him or, like I felt like he was a piece of shit. The last time I saw him, he was, my kids went down to see my parents. It was like a year before my dad died, a year and a half. And I looked at my dad, and he was a walking skeleton. And I'd seen him a couple of times, and, he'd always been fat. He always had a pot belly. He called it his Labanzo, which I guess was I guess it was Labanzo, I don't know. Something with an L that had an Italian sound to it. And, like he was just a walking skeleton. He couldn't see. He had a nurse come in and bathe him. Like he couldn't eat because he had his digestive system was shot, and he was scared shitless of dying. And I was like, oh my God, Jesus Christ, this guy's. I mean, like I pitied him. He looked like a golem. Like I looked at him, he looked like Gollum. My kids didn't care. They didn't know, right? But I'm like, oh my God, right? And this is bad. And my mom was suffering trying to take care of him, but as soon as he died, she died. Like 6 months afterwards, and she didn't really have any purpose, or maybe a year afterwards. But like somehow taking care of my dad was all she was like doing, even though she complained about it and she was looking forward to, not having that burden, I'm sure, to some extent. But it was just pathetic and depressing. The house was 90 degrees, and my kids and I were sleeping on the floor, and I'm like, oh my God, dude, it's 80 degrees outside. It's in fucking Florida. They got the heat on. Like, why do you even have heat in Boca Raton, Florida? When do you ever need heat? I mean, even the winters, and they got the heat on like 90 degrees, and my dad's listening to the Marlins, baseball team game because he can't see, and my mom's in another bedroom watching the game, and they weren't like syncing up totally like the TVs, like, and I'm like, what kind of hell is this, right? But again, like, this get back to my original point here, that everybody goes through difficult periods, and whatever that is for you, and your life can get better, like whatever it is, like your life can improve. I mean, after so many years, and but then there's inevitable things that happen in the new life. And then, of course, there's death, right, for all of us. But sometimes the hope of, your life can get better, but not in the circumstances you're in now. Like, my life wasn't going to get better in the family I was in. My kids, the family was toxic to them. And, they were going to have to go out in the world. And, sometimes when you leave your family, oftentimes when you leave your family, you're able to just bloom a little bit, right? Like things that were suppressed, things that you weren't able to access. And just some of it has to be because you have to start taking care of yourself, and you're forced to go do things that you weren't forced to do before because your family was, taking care of you or whatever, your parents were. So there's when young adults leave their house and they have to go out on their own, you have to either sink or swim, and most people swim to some extent. And, there's some movement and there's some, growth there, and it's a good time, and you're young and you have your whole life ahead of you, right? But you still have your issues and your samskaras, and other people are fucked up, and, you're more likely than not, you're going to have a fucked up marriage and a fucked up kids and fucked up family and fucked up job and all these things, right? And so, if you don't, great. But if that's the case, and that's just what you have to deal with. And, false hope and denial may be necessary just to believe it can get better. But at some point, facing reality and accepting it, like, being grateful for it and looking at it as an opportunity and going within, right? Like if the world goes south you can find refuge within. It's talked about quite often, the Sajmark system, being able to go inside. And, people do that. Like they're in jail or you're in the bed sick and you just go inside and you have your own internal universe and, whatever it is. And you might dream about something better materially. But also you can connect to the divinity within you and just gain sustenance from that, right? Which is, again, a system that I have 100% faith in, but I don't, people struggle with. Because people struggle with everything. People fuck up anything. Because that's, kind of what we are right now. But if you're going to be grateful to God, you got to be grateful to God for everything. Not the blessings. When a guy scores a touchdown, he points towards God. And he's, interviewed after the football game and say, God is great. Well, what about when you lose? Is God still great? They're celebrating because they have a victory and they played well or whatever. What about when you play bad? Is God great then, right? Is God great when, things go south and bad things happen to you? And so is God still in charge of those things? Like it's just that God only blesses you, and then if bad things happen, that's the devil doing things to you, right? It's just, it doesn't work like that. Like everything comes from God or nothing comes from God. And, it just takes a few bad days, one bad day where people are like, fuck you, God, right? People who are religious and spiritual and, and they're like, God, why did you do this to me? Jesus, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? He's tacked up to a cross. His disciples have turned on him. People are throwing shit at him and spitting on him and, humiliating him and treating him like shit. He's like, God, why do you do this to me? Why have you forsaken me, right? Why have you forsaken me, God? Father. Because, he felt like he had, right? And so, the crucifixion is such a big part of the Christian literature, but Jesus wasn't digging it. Like, he wasn't thinking the crucifixion was a blessing. He was like, God, why have you allowed this to happen? Why are these people so sucky? And, why is this the way it is, right? And who hasn't said that in their life? Who hasn't said, oh, God, why is it so fucking sucky down here? Why won't you do something? Why will you why don't you make this world better than it is? So there's that. But if you're going to believe in God, you have to believe that all these things are, that's why it's a test of faith, right? To be grateful in these circumstances. And, Thanksgiving is about being grateful. And in all of its, flaws and things, it's probably the best holiday in the sense that, again, everybody but the turkey, but, being grateful and expressing your gratitude and being grateful and thinking about the things that you're grateful for and accepting the things that are bad for you, knowing that they're there for a reason and they're there for your inevitable benefit. And all those things that I've gone through, these things that I told you, and, again, this is a Cliff Notes version of it. It's made me better at what I do here. Like it's just gave me a perspective and insight into human beings and things that I wouldn't have otherwise. Because I've met saints and I've met like the worst and the best people. I've met the highest and the lowest. And I've seen everybody, in between. And I have I believe a realistic understanding of the conditions on planet Earth and what needs to happen to make things better. And it isn't saving this society and making America great again. And all these Trumpers who have false hope. Because everyone can see the country's falling apart and the world's falling apart. But very few people are willing to go there and realize it and then accept it and start preparing themselves for the worst. And that is whatever it is. People have to make their own choices. You got to do you, right? But, at some point, reality is going to set in. Only spirituality will save this world. It's Paul Romano, definitely pointing to the Apocalypse. And the Ascension, everyone have a blessed day and be grateful.